Ukraine says it will push ahead with efforts to export its grain despite a Russian missile attack on the port of Odesa at the weekend. Russia claims it was targeting a military vessel and arms supplied by Western countries. Saturday's attack came hours after a deal was struck between Russia and Ukraine to allow the resumption of Ukrainian grain exports. The deal is an attempt to alleviate a global supply crisis. DW's Nick Connolly has been to southern Ukraine, where he met the people trying to get Ukraine's food out to the world.
Ukraine is bringing in the harvest. Despite months of war, despite shortages of everything from fuel to workers. Here in this part of southern Ukraine, wheat yields are down 40% on last year, but that's still millions of tons. This is wheat that 500 million people around the world, from Mauritania to China, are waiting for.
This is all grown for people abroad. Ukraine can't and doesn't consume all this food. But no one's buying right now. The traders might be willing to take it off our hands for storage, but we only get paid once it goes to the customers.
This year's harvest is now piling up unsold in Ukraine's granaries, on top of last year's crop, which should have been shipped in the early months of this year, just when war broke out. Ukraine's cash-starved farmers are asking themselves whether they'll even be able to afford to plant next year's crop if the ports don't reopen, giving them a chance to sell what they have and pay for new seeds and fertilizer. With seaports like Odesa shut, Ukraine is trying to redirect a flood through a narrow stream, sending crops out by truck and river barge rather than the huge freighters normally used. The land journey has gone from a matter of hours to weeks, as the trucks back up for miles around, waiting to unload at the hopelessly overstretched river ports. Their drivers can only guess how long they'll be camping out for.
Last time we were here for 3 weeks. When a barge does turn up, that's only 20 trucks worth of grain. And there are thousands of us here. It barely makes a difference.
And the traffic jam continues out on the Black Sea, where over 100 ships wait their turn to enter the River Danube. The river ports can only handle smaller boats, meaning lots are needed. All the Romanian Coast Guard can do is watch and try to manage the sudden influx.
I have never seen such many ships here. You are talking about over 100 plus ships waiting. To increase the capacity of this route is not in the power of Romanian country. Because I told you that the main problem is the capacity of the Ukrainian ports. This is the problem.
Some of these vessels will take their cargo direct to customers in Egypt or Turkey. Other, smaller ships stay closer to home, taking their loads to Romania's main seaport at Constanța, where the grain is collected before being loaded onto bigger ships. But the bottlenecks don't end here. Romania is busy shipping its own harvest, and the little spare capacity it does have is barely making a difference. Ukraine's farmers are finding to their cost that the alternative routes out only add up to a trickle. The government in Kiev estimates exports are still only a quarter of pre-war levels. That's why President Zelensky has been so keen to strike a deal to reopen Odesa. But many here are deeply sceptical that peace at sea is possible while war continues on land.
There's no point opening the ports if that means letting the Russians in by the back door. We'd rather go on as we are, tightening our belts and helping each other out. Anything to avoid being occupied.
Mikhailo has good reason to be worried. In recent days, top Russian officials have once again made it clear that they plan to grab yet more Ukrainian territory.
Let's bring in Timothy Milovanov. He is an economic advisor to the administration of President Zelensky and also a former agriculture minister and now president of the Kyiv School of Economics. Welcome to DW. Last week, after the deal was struck to ostensibly end the blockade of Ukrainian ports, you said this is a major win for Ukraine. It is great to see diplomacy at work during the war. But the next day you posted the attack in Odesa is a reminder to everyone who believes that it's possible to negotiate with Russia. No deal is possible. Are you learning the same lesson over and over about negotiating with Russia and Putin?
What's new here is that the attack comes immediately after the deal being signed. Because usually the Russian playbook, and I have seen it during my time in the government as an advisor as well, was to step up violence just before the deal. And so then when the deal is struck, then they kind of lay off for a couple of weeks, sometimes for a couple of months, and then come back. So the novelty here, they attack immediately after the deal. So there are two reasons for that, in my view. One is it's actually a sign of domestic issues that the Russian government has to demonstrate that the deal is not too sweet for Ukraine, that they will continue to attack. And the other one is to increase the cost of shipping grain, basically by scaring cargo companies. So I think, yes, we are learning, and the entire world is learning, that Russia is not to be trusted. But unfortunately, this is our neighbor. They are here with their tanks and artillery, and we have to export our grain.
Now, what does it mean to Ukraine if millions of tons of Ukrainian grain is not allowed passage through the Black Sea?
That's 40% of export before the war, just the agriculture. And we are a small but open economy, so export is critically important for us. These are billions, tens of billions of dollars, badly needed right now in Ukraine. 2/3 of all export was going through Odesa ports. We have been able to increase some of the capacity, as you have just shown, in the Danube River, but it's still limited. So if we are able to bring Odesa back to full capacity, we will be able to export the stockpile of grain maybe in the next 4 months. But if we can't, then it might be lost for good. And it also will mean that our farmers will not plant grain in the fall.
Now, your farmers are, of course, very concerned about this, but what about the rest of the world? What does it mean for the rest of the world?
Northern Africa, Middle East, and some of the Asian countries rely on Ukraine for food security. Ukraine is a leader, or one of the leaders in top 5 grains, including corn, sunflower, wheat, and some others. That basically means food security issues and political instability, especially in Northern Africa. So this is bad all around.
Now, I know you have the ear of President Zelensky. Let me switch gears now and ask you about his recent sacking of both the head of Ukraine's security service and his prosecutor. You have said these moves are a sign of strength. Why?
During the war, it's very difficult to reshuffle the cabinet or let alone do any changes to law enforcement agencies, because you're basically doing 90% operational issues and only 10% of strategy or appointments. And the fact that the government and the President Zelensky can do changes in appointments suggests that they have operational bandwidth. This is a great sign. That means they don't overwhelm. They are not overwhelmed. That's why I'm saying it's a sign of strength.
OK, but as the president himself said, they were fired in part for allegedly treasonous acts by dozens of their employees working against Ukraine for Russia. That sounds bad. Is the security apparatus in Ukraine massively infiltrated?
It has historically been infiltrated. Now, I don't have the numbers, but I would say it's single digits, maybe even less than that. But before 2014, even the leadership of the security apparatus had Russian passports. So, it's a sea change. But additional factor is that during the wartime, you really need different kind of leaders. And some people who were the heads of the agencies or different ministries, they demonstrated, they stepped up to the challenge. Others, they worked better during the peacetime.
Timothy Milovanov, advisor to President Zelensky, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
The concern over global food inflation is far from over. Wheat prices jumped by 3% at the start of the week following a Russian missile attack on the Ukrainian port of Odesa. The bombing occurred just hours after Kyiv and Moscow reached an agreement for a Ukrainian grain corridor that would allow for some 25 million tons of grain stuck in the country to be exported by sea. Wheat prices dropped 6% on Friday to levels not seen since before the Russian invasion. But the weekend's bombing provided a reality check showing that getting shipments out of Ukraine may not be as simple as once hoped. Well, let's discuss this further with Professor Martin Keim from the Centre for Development Research at the University of Bonn. Thank you very much for joining us on DW Business. I mean, this is a reminder that Ukraine is still at war, isn't it? So how much hope is there that these grain exports can resume as normal at some time in the near future?
Well, I think back to normal, we are far away from that. The missile attacks showed that trust in President Putin and the international agreement is shaky and definitely not given. But there's certainly hope that at least the first ships may resume exporting grain perhaps in a couple of weeks. There are a couple of steps that need to be taken. Mines have to be removed. The grain has to be brought to the ports. Ships have to be made available. International cargo companies have to be willing to send their ships for these exports. This is also an insurance question. So we are still relatively far away from getting back to normal, and there's hope at least perhaps that first exports could start in a few weeks.
Meanwhile, it's been somewhat, 5 months since the invasion and since normal wheat exports were able to take place. What have countries been doing to change how they get hold of their grain in the meantime?
Well, I mean, those countries that are particularly dependent on exports from Ukraine have obviously been looking for other sources, for other exporters, but that's difficult. I mean, the market is tight, and we have seen that prices were at record highs, and that means there isn't just enough grain that could be exported to replace what's missing from Ukraine. And that means some countries got shipments from a few other regions, but all were suffering from the extremely high prices. And this means that hunger has been going up, especially in poorer population segments of Africa and Asia. And we do know that hunger today is much larger than it used to be before the start of the war.
Now that they've seen that, that it's not necessarily reliable to just be getting your grain largely from Ukraine, does that mean that countries are changing how they, in the long term, get their grain, and that actually Ukrainians' exports will never be what they once were? Well,
I think they could go back to what they were if Russia really allows that to happen. Because global demand is increasing, and we have scarcities, we have harvest shortfalls due to climate change, and we are living on a world with finite resources. It's a small planet, and that means Ukraine, with the land and the water that it has, top conditions for agricultural production will certainly be needed, and that's what we hope to get in
a key exporter in the long term. Then, okay, Martin Keim, we've just run out of time, but thank you very much for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
Now, while Russia has been blockading Black Sea ports, Ukraine and its neighbours have been seeking alternative routes for the country's crucial food exports.
Grain stuck at a silo near Ternopil in Ukraine. It should be long gone, but it's still here. The Black Sea is blocked amid the war with Ukraine, so the wheat cannot be transported. The manager of the storage facility measures the humidity frequently because grain stored for a long time molds quickly. We still have 6,000 tons of grain stored here. Where are we supposed to put the wheat when the next harvest starts? It's scary. Any amount of grain could be left on the fields. The farmer tried to empty his silo for the next harvest, sending a truck to neighboring Poland. But the driver was on the road for 14 days and the transportation was extremely expensive. There are long traffic jams on both sides of the border between Poland and Ukraine. Drivers often wait up to 7 days. There are just too few lanes for the vehicles, and that's why we always have this problem. We've been here for 2 days, and that's nothing. But rail transportation is also challenging. Grain needs to be reloaded from Ukrainian wagons to Polish ones because the two countries' trains run on different sized tracks. Another problem, the Polish transport stations are old and ill-equipped, so they cannot handle the huge volumes of precious bread wheat needed in Africa and the large amounts of corn, rapeseed and soy scrap headed for the EU.
Także pracujemy non-stop.
We're working 24 hours non-stop. There's just not enough wagons and workers to reload even more goods from Ukraine. Despite this, the farmers are able to transport around 1.5 million tons of grain to ports in the EU every month, but it's extremely expensive. And in the end, it means that Ukrainian farmers are barely benefiting from the high prices on the global markets. With full storage facilities and a desperate need for grain around the world, these farmers are hoping Ukrainian ports on the Black Sea will soon be reopened.